Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea wrapped up a packed week of diplomacy, hosting APEC in Gyeongju and holding consecutive summits with the U.S., China, and Japan. From resolving the tariff dispute with Washington to opening dialogue with Beijing and restarting shuttle diplomacy with Tokyo, President Lee Jae Myung focused on practical, interest-driven engagement. With both U.S. President Trump and Chinese President Xi visiting Korea, the country drew attention as a possible diplomatic bridge. And with COP30 and the G20 coming up, the question now is how this momentum might shape Seoul's next move on the global stage. For a deeper discussion on this, we connect to Lim Eunjung, Professor of International Studies at Kongju National University. A big welcome.
Hello, good evening.
And also joining us from Busan is Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Busan National University. Good to see you, Professor.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, Professor Kelly, let's start off right away. So, I wonder about your personal assessment of South Korea's overall diplomacy during the APEC leaders meeting in Gyeongju. Were there particular moments or outcomes that stood out for you?
Yeah, I think the big one was Trump and Xi meeting, right? I think there was a lot of global focus on this. It provided South Korea provided kind of like a middle space or sort of bridge, as you mentioned, sort of to use your term, a sort of bridge space for the two sides to meet. It's pretty clear that U.S.-China relations have been on a downward spiral this year, particularly since Trump declared Liberation Day, the tariff wars, what was that, I think back in March. And things have only gotten worse, right? And it was a good opportunity for Donald Trump and Xi to actually meet and start to work on some of the details. And there was some progress, right? At the very least, it seems like the tariff war is going to be somewhat better, right? It looks like, for example, the U.S. sort of soybean export to China is going to come back at least somewhat. There's been some movement on chips and rare earths and stuff like that. I think it was a shame he didn't get too much movement on the strategic issues like Taiwan or the South China Sea or something like that. But maybe that was a bridge too far to expect that something like this. But I think the fact that South Korea was able to provide something along the lines of a neutral territory, a neutral space for this to occur was pretty good. On the other hand, I think the Gyeongju declaration was kind of like all the other previous APEC declarations, didn't really say a great deal, in part because you got 21 different countries with 21 different interests. It's hard to get them to agree on anything, right? So I'm not sure that APEC itself, I'm not convinced that APEC itself is a particularly useful organization beyond just being a platform. But the fact that you did have this big China-U.S. Meeting, and then of course all the other bilaterals, right, particularly with the U.S. and South Korea, I think that was all pretty valuable.
Wow, Professor, thank you for that great overview. It really helps set the stage for the next things that followed. Let's bring in Professor Lim to the conversation as well. So from the APEC meetings to back-to-back bilaterals with Washington, Beijing, and Tokyo, what kind of diplomatic direction or signaling do you think has emerged from this super week of diplomacy?
Well, before again the APEC, I think of many countries in the world and many people in this country also. I think we have been worried about the success of the APEC at Gyeongju, not only just because of international circumstances. Now we all know, Mr. Trump, President Trump's that so-called again the tariff policy that can, of course, in some senses, we try to, of course, understand U.S.'s strategy with the new situations across the border. But at the same time, this is a huge challenge, especially to the country like Korea, because South Korea has been prosperous through the free trade, with many different countries. Including, of course, the United States. So all this kind of, bilateral approaches has been regarded as a big challenge. And as the other panelists, again, the Professor Kelly pointed out, U.S.-China strategic rivalry was another external factor that was, again, the undermining kind of, the ground of the multilateral mechanism, such as, again, the APEC. And internally, too, domestically as well. Our politics has been in trouble for months, and the new government did have very limited time to be really prepared for such a big meeting. Big multilateral meeting in this country. So from the many different angles, I think many people have been worried. However, still the outcome I think was pretty much satisfactory. Most important thing is I think everybody who came to the Gyeongju, I think they have been reconfirmed with the fact that still APEC like a platform is useful because many important countries can gather together, and not only just through the more open multilateral talk, through a series of bilateral talks, again, that they can have a very natural dialogue. So this kind of, again, the opportunity. I think this opportunity gave us, again, provided us, again, another good moment to think about the importance of multilateral mechanism.
Right, definitely. So there had been a lot of accomplishments over the week, but let's first drill into the U.S. summit with South Korea. The long debated tariff issue, of course, it was nearly settled just ahead of the APEC week. What do you think are the most tangible gains for South Korea from that deal, Professor Lim?
Well, all this tariff-related negotiation is painful. Of course, South Korea is not the only case, but especially for a country like South Korea, because again, as I mentioned earlier, South Korea is a trading country, one of the biggest trading country in the world. And in addition to that, we have KORUS FTA, free trade agreement with the United States. The process for that was painful too, but thanks to the FTA with the United States, we both, I think, mutually have been beneficial. However, now again, we live in a very different world, and now we need to adjust everything. So that's the reality we face. So I don't want to really go back to all this, new reality. But tariff is, of course, as a pain and burden our economy needs to digest. But at the same time, probably more bigger, heavier burden was, again, the huge astronomical number of investment. Again, 350 billion US dollar should be invested in the United States. And if you think about the foreign reserve of South Korea as of June 2024, 25, this year, June, as of June this year, our whole foreign reserve is about like 410 billion. So, 350 billion is almost like 70–80% of our whole foreign reserve. So definitely, it is such a big money. So our government was trying to negotiate with the Washington's counterparts, how to deliver this money to the United States. And the biggest, I think, achievement is, again, we agreed on the cap, annual cap. So per year, we have a certain amount of money, which is again the cap to limit the whole amount of money that can be invested from South Korea to the United States, which is crucial because it can be directly influential over foreign exchange rate, again, between the Korean won and US dollar.
Right, so it definitely seemed to reduce the risks from South Korea's hand. Now, moving on, another noteworthy issue was President Trump's approval of nuclear-powered submarines and the discussion around revising the nuclear cooperation agreement. I believe it came just shortly after President Lee's proposal. So from a diplomatic standpoint, Professor Kelly, what does this breakthrough actually represent for South Korea's strategic posture?
Yeah, I have to say that I'm actually rather surprised this is even an issue at all, right? I mean, the idea that South Korea, which is a pretty wealthy country and a long-established U.S. ally and sort of loyal, and the U.S. military is deeply integrated into South Korea's military posture. I mean, the idea that South Korea would have limits on sort of like the missiles it can build and the ships and what kind of engines, all that strikes me as sort of throwbacks, really, to sort of decades past, when Park Chung-hee or some colonel might pop out of nowhere and sort of try to overthrow the government. Therefore, we shouldn't let South Korea have these certain kinds of weapons. That's all over. And I think that's really sort of a recognition of this. I would actually argue that this is pretty low-hanging fruit, that I mean, it's good that South Korea got it, but this doesn't strike me actually as kind of the big breakthrough it's been marketed in the South Korean media, because quite honestly, I don't think it really makes any sense that the United States puts these kind of strategic restrictions on South Korea. If anything, I'd like to see them even looser, right? Donald Trump loves to talk about how U.S. allies need to do more. Well, in the South Korean case, right, if we don't let you guys do more, then the argument doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, we should get rid of all these things and then come back and talk to South Korea about its own defense. And so the idea that you guys can build your own nuclear-powered submarines is great, right? That allows you to build quieter submarines, and you can deploy them against the Chinese and the North Koreans if the North Koreans ever build a sub. And that's all really good, right? It sort of increases the defense burden sharing in the region, which is something that the Americans want. So it strikes me as a win-win all around.
But many had been, actually concerned about how China would feel about this. So let's turn to the summit with President Xi. So despite closer coordination with Washington, President Lee actually pushed for economic and cultural cooperation with China as well, including movement on lifting informal sanctions like the Korean wave ban. How would you evaluate the balance that Seoul is trying to strike over here? Do you see some concrete room for progress?
Speaking to me?
Professor Kelly.
Yeah. And I think this is good, right? I mean, South Korea's progressives, the Minjutang, right? South Korean progressives have long sort of argued for détente with North Korea and China, right? That South Korea is sort of in this middle position between the U.S. and China, and even though it's a U.S. ally, it's trying to sort of avoid openly lining up against China and sort of provoking a kind of Cold War standoff in the region. That strikes me as smart diplomacy for a smallish state like South Korea, which is trapped in the middle of these much larger states. It's a tough neighborhood. It's not easy. And so trying to sort of build these kinds of informal diplomatic bridges and sort of pull down some of these barriers we were talking about, all of that makes sense. It's low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, the K-ban, isn't that big a deal. I mean, I guess it is for that particular industry, but it's not sort of a strategic issue. But to the extent that it builds up towards the larger strategic issues, for example, like what these Chinese emplacements are in the West Sea, which nobody really quite knows what's going on there, to the extent that the South Koreans and the Chinese are laying the groundwork for improved discussion on the really significant geopolitical issues like North Korea's missiles and the West Sea and stuff like that, this is good stuff. But I mean, at some point, Lee and Xi are going to actually have to get to the strategic issues that are pushing South Korea and China apart. And I didn't really see too much movement on that this week.
But as for South Korea, balancing ties with Washington and with Beijing are always tricky. So, Professor Lim, do you think Seoul's dual-track approach to diplomacy is still viable, especially in the climate of intensifying U.S.-China rivalry?
Well, we have been struggling with how to position ourselves. I mean, because of our geopolitical situations, again, the Korean Peninsula is literally the peninsula between the Eurasian continent and then Pacific Ocean. So peninsula faces always, this powers from the both sides. So there's two sides when the two powers are conflicting. When those two powers conflict, definitely the peninsula can face further bigger challenges, which is not only probably for the Korean case. Some other peninsula countries might have a similar situation, but especially the Korean peninsula situation is more serious because, again, we have two gigantic size countries, continental power, again, the Russia and the China, and at the same time, we, of course, have our ally, the United States. So, even though so-called equidistance diplomacy or like a kind of balancing, or whenever we are trying to have literally a balance between the continental power and Pacific power, we have been in trouble. So I don't think, even though our government is trying to have a good relationship with everybody, which is of course a desirable approach, but I don't think everybody's relationship can be at the same level. Of course, we do have a priority. So in that sense, I don't think 50% on China versus like a 50% on the United States. I don't think like that way. Because of course, this is not a zero-sum game. And of course, we have the priority. And another thing I need to highlight is today's US-China strategy rivalry is qualitatively different from the competition between the US and the Soviet during the era of Cold War. Back then, it was literally more like a zero sum. But these days, again, the US, China, mutually, they are also interdependent. I think of, negotiations or dialogues between the Washington and Beijing recently, it has proved how interdependent the two economies are. So what I'm trying to say is, again, this is not a zero-sum game, so we don't need to see the game with that kind of framework. And at the same time, I would say, again, even though we want every, positive relations, but still we have priority.
Right. Prioritizing on your own interests would seem like the key of the Lee administration now. Now, let's also touch upon the Japan front. So, President Lee's summit with Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi emphasized reviving shuttle diplomacy as well. So, Professor Kelly, what kind of long-term impact could this approach have on the future of bilateral relations between the two?
Between Korea and Japan, I think it's a good thing actually that, thank you. I think it's a good thing actually that you had a South Korean progressive president who was actually sort of willing to sit down and sort of at least go through the motions with the Japanese, right? Your viewers may recall that when Moon Jae-in was president, the last progressive South Korean president, relations with Japan really bottomed out. Traditionally, it's been a greater challenge to deal with Japan for the South Korean left than for the South Korean right, which is more willing to sort of deal with Japan and sort of line up with the Americans against China and North Korea. South Korean progressives, of course, are much more mixed on this. There's a more sort of hostility out there on the South Korean left towards Japan. And I think Lee Jae Myung is maneuvering all of those shoals much better than his predecessor, his liberal predecessor, Moon Jae-in did, right? I think it's really good that you had this meeting. It came off cordially. You're seeing the photographs right now. It came off really well, and it looked like the two got along pretty well. There they are, smiling and shaking hands. I mean, that's something that I'm not sure Moon Jae-in was ever able to do. And so to that extent, if you look at sort of previous South Korean conservative presidents, I think the record here is much, much better. I think the Lee administration deserves credit for how well they pulled this off.
Right. So it's, excuse me, it's quite impressive. And of course, the bilateral relationship always needs some steady handling, especially given the historical past between the two sides. Now, zooming out a little bit, the fact that both President Trump and President Xi came to South Korea during the APEC season positioned Seoul as something of a diplomatic platform. Professor Lim, do you think this shows potential for Seoul to serve as a wider bridging role in global geopolitics?
As I mentioned earlier, peninsula by nature, it faces always, again, the geopolitical challenges more seriously compared to other probably countries. And because of that challenges, South Korean government, any South Korean government has been trying to have a good relationship with both sides. Of course, that has been a difficult task for the government. But again, as I mentioned, we definitely have the priority. ROK-US alliance is the fundamental principle for our foreign and the defense policy. I think I don't think that many people in this country will disagree with that view. So having said that, again, that does not necessarily mean that we want to see China with a very, negative perspective. Of course, China is the largest trading partner and then closest neighbor from our side. So when the two countries, again, the US and China, when those two important countries can have a better relationship, which is the situation we are looking for. But unfortunately, even though they are mutually interdependent, however, still they are competing, especially about the future technology. So these days, this competition between the two superpowers is not really Iron Curtain-like situation. is more like a porous. Again, in some area they do compete, but in other area they do cooperate. So we have this mixed situation. So I think it depends on, if I go back to your that question, I think it depends on which agenda we are talking about. So I think South Korea can suggest a more common agenda for those countries for more like a constructive relationship. And in that sense, again, South Korea does have, I think, has a potential power and then capability to be a coordinator or like a facilitator or sometimes a mediator to work together with the other bigger superpower.
So it seemed like this diplomatic super week was a good opportunity for Seoul to show its potential. Now, looking ahead with COP30 and the G20 just around the corner, another busy events lining up, where do you see South Korea's diplomatic agenda heading next? And also tell us what kind of issues or arenas might become more prominent.
Sure. As I mentioned, again, pretty much I think the upcoming events are dependent on the current situations. In some area, probably more cooperative situation we can't probably expect, especially climate change related issue. Because we all know Mr. Trump, President Trump's and his administration, their energy policy and then climate policy changed pretty dramatically. So having had this kind of, again, the situation, they do now emphasize more energy security, which is somewhat understandable. And many other countries are now more concerned about the energy security, which is a more like a short-term challenge compared to, even though climate change is going on and it's not a future issue, it's already our reality, but still countries now prioritize more like a short-term energy security, like, a stable supply, like challenges compared to the global action to the climate change. So definitely climate is one of the probably most challenging issue to proceed further. However, as we saw from the latest, again, the APEC in Gyeongju, AI or like even cybersecurity as well, all this emerging technology, how to gain the control or how to manage or how to protect the information data of our own people, those kind of things are really emerging challenge and an emerging concern for many different countries in the world. So for that, I think South Korea-like country, which has technology and which has, of course, its own, ideas and norms and value, I think this kind of country, South Korea-like country, can contribute more to help the countries gather together to discuss about the future of AI and cybersecurity too.
Definitely. So with many multilateral summits ahead, we'll have to see if South Korea could keep the momentum going moving forward. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Lim.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Kelly, we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.